Hello, bonjour and welcome to your new Bonin Private Wines video. Today I want to explain fairly briefly yet well enough, be reassured, what is the malolactic fermentation? Why do we call it that way? What is it? Well, this is otherwise known as the second fermentation of wine. You know that wine is fermented, meaning that the sugar in grape juice is transformed into alcohol by yeasts through the winemaking process. What you may not have known, although you've probably heard about it here and there without understanding it or remembering, is that many wines go through a second fermentation after the alcoholic fermentation, a fermentation that doesn't affect the sugar, but one that transforms the acids in the wine. So it affects the acidity part of it. Yes, not the sweetness nor the alcohol. And that's interesting, isn't it? Well, let's explain. Wine is, as you know, acidic, so it contains acid or acids. Acids in wine are organic acids as opposed to mineral acids. So organic molecules made from carbon and hydrogen synthesized by the plant. I will go very briefly over the chemistry here. I know it can be a little bit hard to digest, so that's a promise. But wine contains two main acids, the tartaric acid, which is the one that forms the little crystals at the bottom of your old wines sometimes, and the other is called the malic acid. So two main acids in wine. The tartaric acid is the main one here. It is very stable. Microorganisms can't metabolize it or eat it, which is a big factor explaining why wine is so stable over time and why you can age it for so long. Nothing feeds on those acids, especially tartaric. But certain bacteria love to feed on the other acid in wine that is called the malic acid. They eat this acid, which has 4 carbon atoms in the molecule, and they ferment it into lactic acid, another acid that has only 3 carbons, releasing 1 carbon as CO2. And that's a fermentation, the second fermentation of wine, the malolactic fermentation, named after the 2 acids involved, the malic acid and the lactic acid. We'll see in a minute how this matters to the taste and the quality of wine. But just before we do that, so we're clear about what happens with the second fermentation, let's talk about winemaking for a second so you really grasp what's happening here. So at the winery, through the winemaking process, most wines are effectively fermented twice indeed. The second fermentation is run after the first one. The first alcoholic fermentation generally takes about a week or 2 to transform the sugar into alcohol. The wine during that phase bubbles really intensely. It gets very hot as well because the yeasts release a lot of CO2 and calories in the process within the tank. We talked about this fermentation in last week's video. You can watch it here if you've missed it and go a little bit deeper. After this, the wine generally becomes still again as all the CO2 bubbles have been released. The wine becomes calm again. But later, the wine starts bubbling a second time, but this time with very small, fine bubbles. That's when the lactic bacteria have started the second malolactic fermentation. So you've got those 2 phases really separate most of the time. This second phase generally takes at least 2 or 3 weeks, sometimes even a month or more. The malolactic fermentation can be run either in tanks or in barrels. So the first fermentation happens shortly after harvest. So let's say around September or early October, depending on the region and when the grapes are harvested. And it takes about a week or 10 days from there. The second fermentation runs for several weeks, so across the month of October, it's sometimes a little slow starting as well, sometimes even into November or December. And all of those 2 phases that take several months, those are the earliest life cycle of a wine, how a wine is born from grape juice, from the mother vine. And the malolactic fermentation matters for two main reasons. One, the main one, is that the lactic acid resulting from that fermentation is softer, smoother than the initial acid, the malic acid. Malic acid is quite harsh, quite vegetal and a bit biting on your palate, like the acid in a green apple for an image, and an apple contains a lot of malic acid. That's exactly why. While the lactic acid is rather smooth and pleasing, it's the acid of yogurts or cheese, so softer. So the second fermentation sort of de-acidifies the wine a little, rendering it smoother and less grapey. Makes sense. Secondly, the second fermentation adds layers of aromas to the wine. Of course, these lactic bacteria release buttery flavors into the wine, which is particularly important for white wines, especially if you run the fermentation into oak barrels. Those lactic bacteria are similar to bacteria found in milk or in cheese. So they release a lot of creamy, buttery flavors which you can really taste in oak-aged Chardonnays, for example, like those really buttery California Chardonnays, the signature style of older style California Chardonnays. So the malolactic fermentation contributes very importantly to the creaminess of these wines and the buttery characters as well. It's extra smoothness from that second fermentation and extra flavors as well. If you're wondering, winemakers can prevent that second fermentation from happening indeed, or stop it in the middle by simply adding a little SO2, we've talked about SO2 before, or sulfur dioxide after the first fermentation, which blocks all bacteria from developing in the wine. So we do this when we want to preserve the biting acidity of a wine, for crisp whites in particular, for example, or for rosés. We want to keep all the freshness, the refreshing zinginess of a wine, and when we don't want those creamy, buttery flavors ending up in our wine, but we prefer to have the fresh, original, fruity flavors from the grapes themselves. So most red wines and those textural, creamy whites have those two fermentations, while the crisper whites and the rosés only get one single fermentation. Or if you want to remove a little bit of this biting acidity, because there's a little bit too much of it in a white wine, for example, but you don't want to remove all of it to keep some of the freshness, and you don't want it to feel too aggressive, just round it up a little bit. You can apply a little bit of malolactic fermentation, start it and then stop it right in the middle, or wherever you want, really, right at the start, in the middle, or a little bit later, just to keep that balance of acidity and get a little bit of that creaminess out of it. The malolactic fermentation is an important tool for us winemakers to control the taste of a wine and make it just the way we want, and just the way, well, you love it as well. It is a key aspect to what I call the art of winemaking, or the engineering also of winemaking. It's a combination of both, and now you know how and why. On this final note, I'll leave it here for today. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Take care, and I will see you soon in the wonderful world of vino. Cheers.